Conditions at the Rikers Island complex have grown dangerous and dire, with reports of overcrowded cells, open defecation, and a growing COVID outbreak. The jail has been dealing with a staffing crisis, with the city estimating that on any given day, 35% of staff don't show up to work. Also plaguing Rikers are a series of deaths and suicides. 42-year-old Isbadal Karim died last Sunday. According to corrections officials, the cause of death appears to be natural, but, quote, does not change the fact that there are serious issues in our jails. Karim's death is the 10th fatality reported by the jail this year. Alyssa, it feels like local politicians there, both at the state and the federal level, have kind of washed their hands of this crisis because they say they want to close Rikers and they want to open community jails. And so, therefore, that's not their problem. Meanwhile, thousands of people continue to languish in this prison.
Right, and it's not a popular, cause for an elected official to take up, to advocate for, the inmates at Rikers, who are some of the worst among inmates across the country. But it's certainly, these are inhumane conditions. It's against who we...
Well, a lot of them haven't even been convicted of crimes, actually, in Rikers. And
what's the percentage? Because I saw
most,
that
I think.
Most have not.
Because once they get convicted, they get moved to state prisons.
Okay, so that's an important distinction. Yeah. It's more of a temporary holding position. But
temporary, except it becomes years, because if you go to your trial and they want it postponed, that it's 6 months, and then 6 months later they postpone it again for 6 months.
Well, and what was remarkable to me in the reporting is that on any given day, up to 35% of the staff just aren't showing up. So on top of squalid conditions that are completely inhumane, whether you are a criminal or you're awaiting conviction and trial, nobody should be subjected to that. And then on top of it, you don't even have proper security protocols of having guards in place or staff in place to deal with the issues that arise. I know de Blasio has said that he was going to tackle this, but he's been yet to do so over the last several years.
Yeah, and de Blasio, he said he was going to close it without having a real plan to do so, or a plan, to transition anybody out of it. And instead, the population has just surged. And for the left in New York City, it's not that there's a kind of political problem in expressing sympathy for those who are held there. It's that they don't want to talk about investing anything into Rikers to improve the situation, because then that suggests that they're okay with Rikers existing and that they're okay with what's going on. So the second that they're engaging with the problem, then they're on the hook for the problem. So politically, it's easier for them to say, "Well, I'm against this whole thing existing." Well, okay, fine.
Right,
good for you. So am I. Like, everybody's against awful places like this, but you're now in political office. This is your responsibility. If you can't tomorrow get these community jails up and running, then you need to do something about the conditions that people are living in today.
Exactly. And I'd be curious within the city what the level of support is for the community jails and moving that direction.
Zero in the communities. Right. Nobody wants condos in their neighborhood. You think they want.
It's exactly why politicians are passing the buck, and meanwhile conditions are getting worse.
Right. The NIMBY movement is strong and growing. The GOP candidate in New York City's mayoral race, Curtis Sliwa, gave his take on the crisis at Rikers when he was on the show last week. Here's what he had to say about shutting the facility down. Do you think there is any chance that these community facilities could ever replace Rikers, or do you think that we really are just stuck with Rikers basically forever?
Well, remember, it's going to cost $8 billion for 4 community facilities. We're already looking at a $6 billion deficit over 2 years. That means $6 billion 1 year, $6 billion 2 years that de Blasio is saddling the next mayor with. And that's going to be impossible to operate around. It's not going to be a priority then building new jails when you may have to lay off workers or actually cut back on social services. So that's the priority. And quite frankly, I think the social justice warriors would prefer that Rikers get closed, knowing that a lot of these prisons would not be built, and that rather than house inmates who either are doing a year or less because they've been sentenced, or they're being sent upstate, they're waiting in Rikers before doing further time, or they haven't been able to make bail, they would much prefer them to be paroled out into the streets. And to me, that's a recipe for a lot of problems. It doesn't really help anybody involved in that process.
And one of the problems here is that if the left refuses to engage in this conversation, then it's going to be left to people like SQUALOR to set the terms of the debate.
Well, and I think that actually just showed exactly what we were saying, where the two sides are on completely different ends of the spectrum on this, but they both kind of want to wash their hands of immediately dealing with it. Because I don't disagree with him that if we're not in a position where these community police facilities are up and ready to go now, you are going to talk about people being released onto the streets, which on the conservative side, I think many people would object to in the local communities. But on the other side, if you have progressives who don't even want to necessarily invest in bringing up the current conditions, that's how these things become an ongoing crisis that are terrible conditions for the inmates, but also the workers alike. And jails and prisons across the country are facing COVID outbreaks. According to reports, many prison guards refuse to get the COVID vaccine. 6 states have mandated vaccines as a condition of employment, but the rest of the country allows prison staff to forgo the vaccine if they submit to weekly testing. I just have such a hard time with this. If you're working in close quarters, you know that you have the potential to be exposed. You're dealing with people who are coming in and out. I would just think that would be such an obvious thing to get the vaccine.
Right, they're having a very hard time, and the staff shortages are, I think, crimping the ability of people to, the ability of employers to kind of push and nudge people toward getting vaccinated. If you are in these prisons, you're just a sitting duck. There's really little that you can do to to take any type of social distancing precautions to stay away from COVID. It's just a nightmare scenario. Well,
and I know early in the pandemic, we released a lot of people to confine them to house arrest because of close conditions in the jail and overcrowding that could have led to the spread of the virus. But I would be curious to see if some states might move to doing mandatory vaccines for inmates to be able to keep them in jail but still safe from the virus. I haven't seen that raised yet, but I'd be keeping my eyes out for that.
But we should be expanding that compassionate release, a lot broader, because we have the technology now to know whether somebody is staying in their home confinement, and particularly in Rikers, for instance. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who ought to be just released today. He's saying they want all these dangerous criminals out on the street. Most of these are not dangerous criminals. Most of these people are in there for nuisance crimes, for stealing newspapers out of a newspaper bin and selling them on the street, for shoplifting something, and they've been in there for months and months and months because they don't have the money for bail.
Well, and I would actually agree with that notion that we do have the capability to safely confine people to home arrest as they're awaiting trial. It would also save us untold billions of dollars.
And then you can shut it down.
Exactly.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.